Hey everybody, so today I wanted to talk to you about clematis. Clematis are sort of my first love flower. I have tons of them. I grow them everywhere. So I think people are really afraid of growing clematis because I think it's one of those flowers that suffers from a bad reputation of being high maintenance because there's all these rules that are associated with them. So the first thing I would say about clematis is that if you have heard one thing about how to take care of a clematis and yet you've heard something different from somebody else, a lot of times when that happens, I think the answer is not that someone is right and someone is wrong, it's that there isn't just one right answer. And so that's what you need to keep in mind with clematis. There are a lot of different ways to approach them and none of them are necessarily wrong. So briefly, we'll go over the stuff that you probably know about clematis already. There are 3 pruning groups. So there's the group 1, which are sort of, sometimes they're evergreen ones. I mean, we can get into a lot more detail here, but we're trying to do a general overview. These are ones that, generally speaking, they're the very, very first ones to bloom. They're usually smaller flowers, and these don't generally need a lot of pruning. We'll get into that in a second. Group 2s are the large flowering ones. Group 3s are what they call the small flowering ones, although there are several deciduous clematis that, or non-binding clematis that don't necessarily fall into that, and there are some in that group 3 that have big flowers, so it all gets very confusing, right? So the only reason you need to know what group a clematis falls into is for pruning. And the good news is that it's not that important. So it is a little important with that group 1 type of clematis because those are the ones that you really don't want to prune. They have got their buds on them and they're sort of an old wood kind of thing. Now you are going to have to prune those to A, control them because they will get a little wild and out of control, and B, just to sort of rejuvenate, prune them. So when you want to do that is right after they flower. I only have one of those in my garden and they're not particularly common. Now group 2s are these big flowering ones, and that's where all the pruning confusion gets into, and we'll talk through that as we prune one. And then the group 3s, you essentially cut those back. Now, what do you do if you don't know what pruning group you have? Well, first of all, you're not expected to remember all this. I mean, when I was really good about making plant labels, I would make a plant label for a clematis and I would put the group right on the label so I would never forget. So the first thing you can do, which I do all the time, is just quickly look and double check. So you just do a quick Google search, you know how to do that, and find out what pruning group they're in. If you don't know what kind of clematis you have, just watch it for a year. Nothing bad's gonna happen if you just watch it for a year and don't prune it. It might bloom very high up, but you'll get an idea and then you can hopefully identify it, or you can just get a feel for its habit. Those large flowering ones tend to bloom a little earlier, and then the smaller blooming ones are the group 3s. Those tend to bloom like July through September. So I think the type of clematis that most people have, and when people think of your typical clematis, they're thinking of that group 2 type. And those are the sort of the in-between ones in terms of pruning. Or at least that's what you've been told. So for years, I pruned those, and I'm going to show you how I've been doing it for years. Because right behind me, I've got a Henry clematis, white flowering. It is one of the few group 2s that I actually have left in my garden. I have gotten rid of many of them actually, or just don't grow them anymore after they die. So what I have done for years is sort of a thirds thing. I leave roughly a third of the stems long, roughly a third of the stems sort of half, and then roughly a third of the stems cut right below or right above the lowest bud on them. It turns out you don't really have to. There is this great book called Clematis, and it's a guidebook. It was put out by Kew Gardens, and I will put a link to it for you so you can check it out. And it really gives a lot of great information, and they actually dispense with this whole notion of this theory of pruning in thirds. They actually say pruning them back hard is just fine. So there you go. 2 ways to do things. Neither one of them is right. I am going to show you this third route with the Henry behind me, and we'll start there. Okay, so these big thick stems coming out of the ground here, this is Henry coming out, and you can kind of, now I've got multiple clematis growing up this trellis, which complicates it, but you can see they come up here and then they end here. So what I like to do is sort of trace them out and just see what we're dealing with first. Not every stem is going to be viable, so you want to look for these nice fat buds. They'll always be at an axil where a little vine came out. Just look at your stems, keep about a third up here. Somewhere in here you're going to cut one of these middle ones. Now one of the things you can do when you're cutting these is you can just work your way down. Sometimes I clean up the little viney bits. Just because it's easier to sort of see what's going on. You can always, as they say, you can always cut more, but you can't take off what you cut. So sometimes I start from the top and work my way down so that I don't accidentally cut something at the bottom that I would have liked to leave. It's always good to look for those fat buds. Those are really the key to know where you need to be doing something. Okay, this one doesn't have that many stems, so it doesn't take that long to prune. Okay, so you can see on this one, I've cut, this is the lowest one that had the rabbit damage. There's a little set of buds, so it's 2 sets of buds up. This one was also not a lot happening there, so there was everything above this area was not looking great. So I cut that there, but you can see off the stems of these side shoots here, there are some buds, so we left those. And then if you follow this one up, this one is about at, half or so. And then these two go up fairly far, and you can see that I've cut to a fat bud there and another set of buds there. So the next thing to do after you do this is add some rose tone. Like pretty much every vine, clematis want and need a lot of fertilizer. So I fertilize once when I prune for the first time. And now I'm a little late on pruning, you guys. So this is something you can start looking at doing this in like, late winter, early spring. I'm a little late because I want to make sure those buds were really easy to see when we did this video. So I don't know, a handful is what I put in there. Brush it into the ground, especially if you have dogs, because apparently dogs love espoma fertilizer. And then come back and water this in. Really. So on this trellis I have one of my absolute favorite clematis. This is Guernsey Cream, but you probably can't see it right now, and I'll tell you why. That's because the rabbits have had a field day with it. You can see it coming up right here. This is what clematis look like when they first come out of the ground. Look for these sort of purplish stems with a little bit of green on them. So I know what you're thinking here. That beautiful clematis has no chance. Well, here's the thing. It does, and it's gonna bloom this year. It's gonna bloom later than it would have otherwise had it been left alone by the rabbits or the deer, blaming the rabbits. But that's the thing. So this is a group 2. So if you'd been listening to what we've been told all these years, you would think this clematis has no chance of blooming, but it will. Now, will it bloom as much as it has in the past? Maybe not. Will it bloom at the same time? Probably not, although this is one of the earliest ones in the garden, so it'll probably still bloom pretty early. But it will still bloom. It is amazing the amount of growth that these clematis can put on. So I'll fertilize it, and frankly, the rabbits have done my pruning for me. So here's the other thing with group 2 clematis. You can sometimes get them to rebloom. If you prune this back and fertilize it right after it flowers, you can sometimes coax these into more flowers, although not as many, later in the year. So it's worth giving that a shot. Now this really messy vine that you've seen popping up behind our seagull here, this is a little seagull. He came with a house and he gets to stay on the front porch there. So this I just sort of push up through that railing. This is Betty Corning, and Betty Corning is a great example of group 3 clematis. And you can see how many stems it gets and how it gets to be kind of a mess. Quite pretty when it's blooming, not so pretty now. So this is the beauty of the group 3 clematis, because you're not going to believe how great this is to prune. So on the group 3s, again, you'll see these fat buds at the bottom, and you just want to cut about from the second bud up, sometimes the first bud up. Look for a nice fat bud and make a cut there. Some stems won't show any buds, and you can cut those all the way back to the ground. Those are probably dead, and new buds will come from the ground. Now you can do a bit of a whack here too and just kind of aim for the middle, but sometimes it's kind of nice to make sure that you're going to have nice buds. You can also, if you want to just take the bulk of it off, you can cut the top all the way off and then come back and sort of fine tune your cuts. Key here is, don't worry too much about this. You can see that this is put in, that it's managing most of this just fine. And it's not going to be upset if you don't do it perfectly, because it's plenty healthy plant. Okay, so I think that's the basics of pruning. What I want you to just take away from this is that you're not going to do anything bad. Now, there are a couple other things you can do. You can really get creative with pruning. So for instance, on some of my group 3s, I actually don't prune them. I have a Prince Charles, which is kind of a light blue, that grows through my limelight hydrangea. And last year it only got about maybe 3 feet tall as it was sort of climbing through my shrub there. I would like it to be taller. So this year I'm not going to any viable stems. I'm just going to leave them and let them grow and keep going up. So you don't have to prune them all the way back if you don't want to. I do that also with another one called Grave Tie Beauty, which I grow up the serviceberry, and last year it was about 15 feet tall. So you don't have to do that. You just need to understand sort of what you're trying to achieve. Now, when it comes to fertilizing, I think you've come to understand it's important. So that rose tone works really well. It's hard to do too much with that. They say fertilize once a month. I highly doubt I actually ever get to fertilizing once a month, but I do it when I prune, and then I do try to hit it once a month if I think of it. But I don't do it when they're in flower. Now, the next thing about clematis is to just talk briefly about support. Now, there are vining clematis and non-vining clematis. The vining clematis needs something small to hang on to, like the width of a string. So if you want them to climb up an arbor, they will not climb up like a big, thick arbor with like inch-wide posts on it. So you will have, got a little clematis in my hair right now. So you will have to provide something else for them to climb. Now, you can tie strings to help them climb. Chicken wire works great, or even like that deer mesh netting, something to get them going. In lieu of that, you can sort of tie them in and they become sort of self-supporting, and you can kind of just coax them in the direction you want them to go. Frankly, that's how I do most of my clematis, is I just sort of weave them around and let them sort of figure it out. Now, there are non-vining clematis as well, and I grow a ton of those, and I think those are really cool plants. I let a lot of them just sort of flop around the garden. Some of them sort of get to be kind of bush size, and you just sort of put it like maybe 30 inches tall, and you just sort of put a support around them or hold them up with other perennials around them that will sort of provide that support. So not all of them will get those little tendrils that help them climb. So just know that, and also know that those have to have something really small to grab onto. And if you don't give them something small to grab onto, they will grab onto the stem next to them, which is not great. Okay, so planting clematis. If you ask some experts, I have been doing it wrong. I have read from 2 highly esteemed clematis people 2 different ways of planting some clematis. So just know, again, that it's not an exact science. Now, with clematis, the thing you need to know when you're planting them, it's all about the root. Clematis have enormous root systems, and you want these roots to be super happy and worry about the flowers later. So if you go to your local nursery and they have a clematis that's full of beautiful flowers and it's like 4 feet tall, you probably really don't want to buy it, because you know what I'm going to tell you to do if you buy that plant? I'm going to tell you to cut those flowers off. And that is so hard to do. So the other thing that I know you have heard about clematis, because everyone has heard this, is this whole head in the sun, roots in the shade situation. Okay, great adage, but here's what that really translates to. It wants moist roots. It doesn't need to have shaded roots. It needs to have moist roots. So you will note that I grow a lot of my clematis out there with really nothing shading those roots other than mulch, and not entirely a thick layer of it all the time. So just know that you're aiming for a moist root zone. So how do you get that? Well, I have a hole. I'm going to plant this one. This is Durandii. This is a non-binding deciduous clematis, so this would fall into group 3. And it'll just kind of make its way up. I think it'll get maybe 4 or 5 feet tall, but it won't have anything to sort of grab onto anything. So I'll have to sort of twine it around things, and it's amazing how these stems get firm enough to sort of manage themselves. Beautiful blue flowers on this one. I have already dug the hole. Now, let me tell you one other thing before I get over there. So for years, I planted my clematis in one way, and that was to plant them deeply. And that is absolutely what you must do if you're planting a group 2 clematis. You must plant it deeply. In the case of this one, I would plant it, now he's cut this one back quite a bit because it's a group 3. Usually if you get a group 2, I would plant it 3 inches below where the crown is. I know that sounds crazy, but here's why. If you plant it low like that, you will have more buds that emerge from underneath the ground, which is really helpful if you have a rabbit come along and take care of it, or if you get clematis wilt, which those group 2s are prone to get this thing called clematis wilt. By the way, if that happens, you just cut it back, water it, cut back the affected part, water it, and then sometimes it'll just go away. So don't be too frantic about it. Sometimes it doesn't, but that's sort of the way to deal with it. It's a fungal situation. So that's why it's really important to plant your clematis deep. Now, I've also been told to plant them at an angle and deep so that they get not only the little the new sprouts that are sort of forming at the top over here, but also they sort of form more this way. Do it, don't do it, I'm not sure it matters. Now, I have been planting all my clematis that way, and I have just not too long ago learned that theoretically you're not supposed to be doing that with group 3 clematis. So I'm not going to do that with this one. But I'm going to say if you do it, nothing bad happens because all of mine have been planted most of mine have been planted that way. So here's the deal. Dig a nice deep hole. I'm going to throw some composted manure in the bottom of that. Nice, rich stuff that will help it keep some moisture. And a handful of bone meal. If you don't have bone meal, more of that Espoma rose tone would be fine too. Mix that in the hole. We're going to water it really well, and then we'll go from there. So I've already dug the hole and added in some manure. Now we're going to add in a little bit of bone meal, handful or so, cup. Mix that all in. And then the clematis goes in. Clematis are known for having this kind of crazy looking yellow root system. So these are you can see the roots on this, these bright yellow roots. That's how you can often tell something's a clematis. Now I'm going to actually try to line this up with the soil. And then I'm just going to backfill a little bit. And then I'm going to get in here and I'm actually going to get the hose in here before I finish backfilling, just to get this hole nice and moist. This method of filling the hole with water before you finish filling the top is actually really good for almost anything you're planting. It just makes sure that those roots are nice and moist, and it helps eliminate that settling that happens all at once. You'll still might have to deal with some of that, but I actually have another clematis growing right behind this, which is, I think, sugar sweet blue, maybe. All right, so that doesn't look like much, right? But give it another water. I think there's a good chance we might see flowers on this year. But you never know, right? Okay, the next step now is to mulch this. So I'm actually just going to use some shredded leaves, which makes a really nice mulch. Also very much free. And these will break down and be wonderful on there. And always a good idea to put the tag in there, if only so you remember where it is in spring. So I know you were probably wondering when I planted this what I was going to grow this on. And this is, I think I got this from Gardener Supply. I don't know what it's called, but it's this sort of framework. Now, the goal is that hopefully this clematis fattens up and sort of fills this up. In the meantime, it'll be kind of pretty. And I have this other clematis that should kind of wrap its way around there. These are some tiny tough stuff hydrangeas, so it might sort of intermingle with that, all of which I'm okay with. One of my favorite ways to grow clematis actually is to grow them through shrubs and up trees, and just sort of in natural ways rather than having to provide a trellis for everything. So hopefully that gives you guys some confidence to try clematis. They're not as hard as anyone makes them out to be. They're great garden plants and you can tuck them in everywhere. Just ask me, I've got, I don't know, 30 or 40 of them.